Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I've been asking Professor Stefan Wolff of the University of Birmingham about how efforts to liberate and protect Ukraine might change with the Donald Trump presidency. Stefan Wolff is a professor of international security. If you want to hear more of his thoughts, he co-manages Navigating the Vortex, which publishes newsletters and podcasts on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Link, as always, in the description below. So I think the first question would be, so given the importance of intelligence sharing with the United States, but given Trump's behaviour in the past, as well as the behaviour of some of the people around him, his chief of staff's been implicated in things, can we trust the Americans with sensitive intelligence, particularly pertaining to Ukraine or the Middle East?
Well, I mean, the optimistic answer would be yes, we should, not least because there has always been sort of a two-way exchange of information, maybe a little bit more freely from our side here in the UK, and maybe a bit more selective from the US side. But there's no question that the US-UK intelligence relationship is probably one of the best established and institutionally deepest that we have. And that then raises immediately exactly the two problems that you have pointed to. One is that Trump clearly doesn't necessarily play by any rule book. It doesn't mean that he will immediately throw out the rule book and sort of share sensitive data on social media or pick up the phone and call Putin. The second thing then relates to the people he is appointing around himself, who are not necessarily in all cases sort of tried and trusted intelligence professionals. So I think there's this dual risk here, and I think it will take some time for us here in the UK to figure out how this relationship will actually develop over time. I mean, it survived reasonably well during the first Trump administration. I think it then became stronger again under Biden, and we'll just have to see, I think, how it plays out over the coming months after Trump becomes inaugurated in January.
In terms of Ukraine specifically, so I mean, there's a few things from my point of view. First of all, the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, has suggested a deal where Russia keeps its territorial gains, a demilitarized zone policed by European forces, and that Ukraine would have to agree not to join NATO or potentially even the EU. Wouldn't that just give more confirmation to Putin that the West is weak and he will use the opportunity, which he surely wants at the moment anyway, to rearm and reinvade later on, presumably?
I think these are all fair points. I mean, the question then is, what's the alternative? And here I think, I mean, where J.D. Vance is coming from, I think is less a perspective on Ukraine as it is a perspective on China and the need for the US to more or less disengage from Europe, potentially from the Middle East, and really throw all of its resources into the Indo-Pacific, developing relationships there with already existing and potential new partners, and really sort of confront China in the Indo-Pacific. So I think from that perspective, the deal that you have described is one that has been floating around for quite some time. There were some advisors or self-appointed advisors to Trump who circulated something quite similar earlier in the summer. And you could even go back to the presumed deal that was very close to being struck back in April, May 2022, so in the first couple of months since the invasion, which basically would have recognized more or less the front lines as they were before February 2022, made Ukraine a permanently neutral country, so no NATO membership, and probably have curbed Ukrainian military capabilities. The reason why it failed then and the reason why it's quite unlikely to succeed now either is that it didn't come with any credible security guarantees for Ukraine, whatever would be left of it after the deal. And that has now gotten us into another, I think, rather unhelpful conversation, which is about, well, if it's not NATO, then should Ukraine go nuclear and basically go back to, well, prior to the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994 and basically reactivate its nuclear program and then have a credible deterrence against a Russian defection from whatever deal is being made now by Trump.
Is the reason at the moment that we're effectively leaving Ukraine to manage its own defense, although with support? Is it still, at this point, a fear, whether on America's part or just in general, of nuclear escalation on Russia's part? Is there any credible reason why we do not actually just say, if America pulls out, then why don't we just send in European forces, which I think Poland would be quite keen on, into Ukraine to support them on the battlefield?
I think it's less the nuclear escalation that people fear, partly because, I mean, there Putin would probably get significant pushback, certainly from China, where Xi Jinping has on quite a number of occasions expressed a very strong preference for or against nuclear escalation. I think it would also be difficult for Putin to manage relations with countries like India, Brazil, probably South Africa, if he deployed nuclear weapons. I think the fear is that Russia will simply escalate further a lot of the what used to be called active measures by the KGB that we have seen, in particular in Europe. So, I mean, there have been arson attacks against a warehouse in London, an assassination plot against the CEO of a major German armaments company. So, I think all of that is what, in particular, Europeans fear at the moment, that if they push too far, Russia will simply invest more into quite effective destabilization operations against European countries.
So because where I have a problem is I look at Russia and I see a country that has a small economy and not looking like a particularly effective conventional forces. If America said, here is the deal, and Kiev rejected it out of hand because it means, well, hang on a minute, you're allowing Russia to get away with its invasion and it will only come back for more later anyway. And it refuses to go along with it and says it will fight alone. And there will be countries such as Poland who will also recognize the threat to them. If America effectively is saying it's going to abandon its leadership of NATO, at least in this theatre, is there a possibility that more European forces just say, well, we will take the lead then? For example, does Donald Tusk say, well, we will take the lead and we will actually join Ukraine openly in battle? Is that a possibility?
Not in the immediate future. I think what we might see is more European funds being spent on defense, not just in terms of GDP proportions going into the defense budget, sort of under the NATO 2% rule, which I think Trump again is going to push quite hard for. There have been reports out this morning that the EU is now considering allowing the use of cohesion funds to be spent on security projects. That would certainly release a large chunk of money for European countries to strengthen their own defenses, in particular, sort of the frontline states, from the Baltic Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia to some extent. So all of that, I think, would be quite possible in terms of strengthening a more autonomous European defense and security capability. What I do not see immediately is Europe being in a position to ramp up its defense industrial base in such a way that it could massively supply Ukraine, in particular with air defenses, with artillery munitions. And I think there would be massive pushback both within NATO and within the EU if countries like Poland or Latvia, who have sort of talked about this in the past, were to say, well, we are actually going to send troops to support Ukraine.
Right. The preferential strategy presumably in the short term would be to try and persuade the United States not to at least pull out completely. So in terms of possible bargaining chips, can we push things like the fact that, we buy munitions that are going to be used in Ukraine from America, and it would hurt this sort of idea about Trump being transactional, are the things that will work. Because it's actually quite reasonable, surely from Trump's point of view as well, to say that they are spending in excess of 3% of their GDP on defence. And most countries, ironically, the countries in Europe that seem to are the ones immediately in the firing line of Russia, not so much the others. So that's quite reasonable from his point of view anyway, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
But given that I don't think there's any sign that governments are going to suddenly ramp up their spending on defence, are there anything else we can push in terms of, the arms we're basically purchasing from America, which will end up in Ukraine, or, something like that? Is there any leverage we have that will appeal to Trump's transactional nature?
I think very little. Partly because, in the long term, it's also questionable whether actually spending money on buying arms in the US is really going to be that helpful for Europe in terms of developing its own defense industrial base. So, really what needs to happen is massive investment into our own European ability to produce stuff that can be used either for our own defense or to support partners like Ukraine. I think what we also need to consider here is that, the phone call between Trump and Putin, whether it took place or didn't take place, let's leave that aside for the moment. But certainly one of the things that was reported is factually absolutely correct. There is still a very large number of US troops that are being stationed here in Europe. So it's also not that these could be pulled out overnight. The US also for strategic reasons does need at least some bases in Europe, because that's obviously much closer to the Middle East, where the US is still having significant interests, whether that's the defense of Israel, or whether that's dealing with Iran or dealing with any of the terrorist groups in the region. So I think from that perspective, we should also not overstate the actual feasibility of a very quick pullout from Europe that the Americans will make under Trump, or even will want to make, given sort of a broader strategic setting in which they will operate.
So essentially, from Donald Trump's point of view, it seems he wants to be this guy who, like in the last one, he said, there were no wars under me, and he wants to be this peacemaker again. He says he can get a deal for Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't actually said how. So if Ukraine simply refuses anything that does not secure its internationally recognized borders, and if Europe backs Ukraine up, then from the other side of you, is there anything really Trump can realistically do then to that doesn't actually then start to put pressure on Russia? Can he actually get away with just abandoning the whole thing? And if he can Europe, at least while it ramps up, if it wants to ramp up any sort of capabilities, at least keep Ukraine maintaining a stalemate in the meantime?
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are sort of three different elements to that. So one is that I think from Trump's perspective, it will very much depend on who doesn't play ball with whatever his proposal might be. And it's not immediately clear that Putin would jump to the opportunity to make a deal on Ukraine now, because he is not under any real pressure right now. I mean, his forces at very high cost are still making territorial gains in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. Very slow, but they are taking more territory from Ukraine on basically a daily basis, whether that's 10 meters or 100 meters or 1,000 meters, but it adds up over time. I think the Ukrainians are also under real pressure in the Kursk region, where they have established this little bulge after their own incursion onto Russian territory back in the summer. So I think Putin, again, is most likely going to play for time, push the Ukrainians out of Russia, thereby taking away their bargaining chip, and getting more territory in Donbass. So when Trump then actually really comes calling, Putin then has a front line that actually is more advantageous to him than what he might have now or in 2 weeks or something like that. So I think in that sense, right now, it isn't just Ukraine that is saying no, it's also Russia that is not necessarily embracing the opportunity of a Trump brokered deal. Now, if that continues until after Trump's inauguration, which is when he can actually really do something credible. I mean, he can talk about it now, he can prepare the ground, but he will only really have the power to do anything after January 20th. Then I could very well see him also saying to Putin, well, if you don't play ball, then I'm actually going to double down on support for Ukraine and really sort of force Putin to come to the table, because on the battlefield, the Russian position would then worsen. Regardless of how this plays out, the second major issue here is not so much the deal itself, but also to make it stick in the long term. And here, of course, I think people are rightly worried that Russia will not be negotiating in good faith, might just take it as a break, regroup, and start again in a year or 2 years time. So from that perspective, we are then talking about credible security guarantees. And I think here it is where Europe potentially could sort of get a foot in the door by saying to Trump, okay, we are going to make sure that there is a credible security guarantee for Ukraine. We are going to back this up with, both actual military commitments, but also political, economic support for Ukraine, but have some kind of transition phase where the Americans don't pull out immediately and the Europeans then have to step into a void without necessarily having the capabilities to do it. So I think there is quite possibly a bargaining space here between the Europeans and the Trump administration that would sort of bridge this gap between the Americans wanting to pull out sooner, the Europeans being ready to take over later. So I think that's where also a sort of re-stabilization of the sort of transatlantic alliance could come in with more European weight and potentially less American weight, and a reorientation or a complete pivot of the US to the Indo-Pacific.
And that's realistic, is it? So we can effectively say to Trump, well, let's just phase this out, and we will sort of slowly, sustainably take over, so that you can withdraw and mess about with China if that's what you want to do.
I mean, it is a possibility. I mean, the two issues there are, I mean, the German government has just collapsed.
Yes.
And I mean, whoever will take over after the new elections, it will probably still be a very pro-Ukraine coalition.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell by my accent that I sort of follow German politics occasionally. So I still do think that it's probably going to be another sort of grand coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, which would ensure continued support for Ukraine. But there is a very strong opposition movement in Germany that basically thrives on the idea of making peace with Putin, in particular in the eastern, former eastern, in former East Germany, basically. You also have weakness in France. I mean, Macron is still politically in trouble. You have, you know, a right-wing populist government in Italy. So there are a lot of issues on the European side where, yes, in theory, that would be a deal. Is it a deal that Europeans necessarily want to make? And the flip side of that is that a Trump pivot to Asia to contain China is also going to be not easy to stomach for a lot of the Europeans who may have weaned themselves off Russian oil and gas, but who still very heavily depend on China as an export market, if you look at countries like Germany, but also just in terms of supply chain.
Well, I mean, this sort of goes into trade, but if Trump applies his very high tariffs to Chinese exports, particularly cars, Europe's going to find itself with a lot of cheap Chinese EVs coming our way as well.
Or they have to go a similar way. And that, again, I think there would be resistance in among some of the major European players who don't actually want to sort of create more trouble in an already difficult relationship with China.
Yeah. So there we are. I've linked Professor Wolff's outlet in the description below, as I say, if you're interested in learning more about his thoughts on issues like this. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.